You remember the sound, that little click, that startup chime. Maybe you were 7, maybe 8. You'd wake up before everyone else, pull it out from under your pillow, and disappear into it. No Wi-Fi needed, no charging, just 4 AA batteries and a tiny green screen that somehow contained entire worlds. The Game Boy, the gray brick that survived everything you threw at it, and a few things you didn't mean to. It was less a video game and more a piece of furniture that happened to run Tetris. But what if I told you the most iconic handheld video game system ever made was built, at least in part, in a secret factory by a company that wasn't entirely supposed to have the blueprints? Because that's exactly what happened. And the story starts somewhere you'd never expect. This is Brazil, the late 1980s. While American kids were openly buying Game Boys at Toys R Us, while Japanese kids were lining up at electronics shops in Tokyo, Brazil was living in a completely different technological reality. Not because Brazilians didn't want these things. They desperately did. But because the Brazilian government had built a legal wall around the entire electronics industry, it was called the Market Reserve Policy. And the idea on paper wasn't crazy. Brazil wanted to build its own technology sector, to protect it from being crushed by cheaper, more advanced foreign competition before it ever had a chance to grow. So they passed laws that said simply, foreign electronics don't come in. No importing Nintendo, no importing Sega, no importing any of it. If you wanted a game console in Brazil during this era, well, you bought a Brazilian one. The problem was, and there's no delicate way to say this, the Brazilian clones were rough. Companies like Gradiente, CCE, and Dynacom were churning out machines with names like the Phantom System and the Dynavision. Machines that looked vaguely like Nintendo products if you squinted. Machines that broke faster, had fewer games, and lacked whatever invisible quality made the real thing feel special. They were centaurs of electronics. The body of one device, the soul of another, the build quality of neither. The demand for the genuine article was enormous. And so predictably, a black market exploded. Smuggled Game Boys circulated through Brazil like contraband. A unit that cost $50 in New York could sell for the equivalent of $500 or more in São Paulo. And people still bought them. And that's how much Brazilians wanted the real experience. Nintendo, sitting in Kyoto, knew exactly what was happening. They watched the demand. They saw the smuggling. They understood the hunger. But their entire manufacturing model was built around producing in Japan and exporting. Brazil's laws made exporting there impossible, and Nintendo wasn't about to rethink their whole supply chain for one market. So they waited. They did nothing. And the void was filled by pirates, smugglers, and one very ambitious Brazilian electronics giant. Meet Gradiente. If you grew up in Brazil during this era, Gradiente was everywhere. Their stereos were in your living room. Their televisions were in your parents' bedroom. They were reliable, respected, and they had something most Brazilian companies lacked: serious engineering capability and serious ambition. Gradiente looked at the black market and asked a question that sounds simple, but was actually radical. Why are we letting smugglers profit from something we could build ourselves? They decided they were going to make the real Game Boy, right here in Brazil. But to do that, they faced one seemingly impossible problem. Nintendo's technology was an absolute vault. Every chip inside a Game Boy was proprietary. The custom CPU, the graphics processor, the cartridge connector with its specific pin configuration. Watch the exact dimensions of the shell, the precise feel of the buttons under your thumbs. Nintendo had patented and protected all of it. There were no open blueprints. There was no licensing agreement. There was no friendly phone call from Kyoto offering to help. There was nothing. So Gradiente's engineers did what any desperate, brilliant team of people does when the legal path is closed. They found another way. They went to the black market. They bought smuggled Game Boys at the inflated, criminal prices everyone else was paying. And then, instead of playing them, they took them apart. They x-rayed the chips because you can't just look at a custom semiconductor and know what it does. You have to map it layer by layer, like an archaeologist. They traced every single circuit by hand, once drawing diagrams of connections that Nintendo had never published. They measured the plastic shell's exact thickness, its precise color tone, the specific weight of the buttons. They didn't just want a console that looked like a Game Boy. They wanted one that felt like a Game Boy, that sounded like a Game Boy, that a Brazilian kid picking it up for the first time would immediately recognize as the real thing. It was like trying to recreate a masterpiece painting using only a blurry black and white photocopy. Possible theoretically, but it required a level of obsession that borders on madness. And they couldn't just clone it, they had to make it cheaper. Brazilian consumers were not going to pay American prices, so every component was scrutinized for cost. The plastic, Brazilian-sourced resin, it matched as closely as possible to Nintendo's spec. The buttons, a local supplier briefed to replicate Nintendo's exact tactile resistance, that specific soft click that your thumb would memorize without you even realizing it. This wasn't simple copying. This was cost engineering a miracle, component by component, in a factory thousands of miles from the company whose product they were meticulously recreating. After roughly 2 years of what can only be described as clandestine hardware archaeology, they were ready. They didn't call it a Game Boy. They called it the Gradiente Handheld. But everyone knew exactly what it was. It looked identical. It ran the same cartridges. It played the same Tetris, the same Super Mario Land, the same everything. And it was available legally in Brazilian stores for a fraction of what the smuggled version cost. It was an overnight sensation. The black market didn't just slow down, it collapsed. Why pay 5 times the price for a smuggled device when you could walk into a department store and buy the exact same experience with a receipt? Gradiente had done what nobody thought was possible. They had built the real thing at home on their own terms, or so they thought. Because here's the thing about reverse engineering. The law doesn't always agree with what feels fair. Nintendo noticed. Of course they noticed. And they came with lawyers. Their patents were registered in Japan and the United States, and even in Brazil's legal Wild West, where the market reserve policy had created enormous ambiguity. Nintendo wasn't going to let this go without a fight. The lawsuit was messy and public and dragged on for years. Gradiente's defense essentially argued that Brazil's own laws had made this necessary, that the market reserve policy had created a situation where cloning was the only path to serving Brazilian consumers. It was a remarkable argument. We broke your rules because your rules were incompatible with our country's rules. While the courts deliberated, something remarkable was quietly happening. Gradiente's console was so good, so faithful to the original, that they started exporting it. The secret Brazilian factory was now supplying other South American countries with a product they couldn't officially get any other way. The pirate operation had become a continental supplier. When the dust finally settled, the outcome was, fittingly, strange. Gradiente could keep manufacturing, but they had to pay Nintendo a royalty on every unit. The rogue factory had become a licensed partner. The company that began by buying smuggled Game Boys off the street was now writing checks to Nintendo in Japan. The logos on the factory wall changed. The deal was done. So the next time you think about that gray brick from your childhood, the one you dropped, broke, lost, found again, and loved unconditionally, think about where it might have actually come from. Your indestructible little companion might have been born in a factory that started as a patent-evading reverse engineering operation, staffed by engineers working from X-rayed circuit boards and smuggled reference units, driven by a country's hunger for technology it wasn't legally allowed to import. The Game Boy story isn't just about gaming. It's about what happens when globalization meets protectionism, when a locked vault meets a determined engineer, when a country says, we can't have that, and its people find a way to build it anyway. Sometimes to get the real thing, you have to build it yourself, in secret, in Brazil. What everyday object from your childhood do you think has a secret origin story? Let me know in the comments.